Hi, I'm Anna Hoffman, and welcome to this special episode of Data Exposed Live. I say special because we're actually live streaming from the Dev Intersection / Azure SQL and SQL Server Conference here in Orlando, Florida. So Marisa is also here with me. She's actually in the room next door. We're super excited to be here. We might have some cameos from folks like Bob Ward and Buck Woody, depending on time. But that being said, we're from wherever you are streaming in from, we want to encourage you to head over to Learn TV because we'll be monitoring your questions, but we'll also be monitoring from Twitch, Twitter, YouTube, wherever else we're streaming to today, including the Reactor. So thanks so much for joining us, and please ask your questions. We have such a packed agenda today. Like, I don't know that we've ever had this many people on the show before. It's exciting, it's terrifying. Hopefully it all goes well. We've got so many announcements and demos. So we're going to get right into it by talking about some of the product updates and content updates related to Microsoft Build, which happened just a few weeks ago. Now, the first update I want to talk about, and of course, I'm a little bit biased because this is something I was involved in, but the first thing I want to mention is this new learning path that we launched at Microsoft Build. Myself and Davide Mauri did a Learn Live session where we went through the whole learning path pretty much live. So if you go to that URL, you can access a free sandbox, which includes lots of ways to get hands-on and build full stack applications with Azure, of course, including Azure SQL. So there's some fun stuff with serverless in that session. So definitely check it out. And with that being said, just checking, hopefully I'm not freezing, but it seems like it's going well with everyone. If you are having any issues with the stream, please comment so we know, because we definitely don't want to be streaming blurry streams. Nobody likes those. But that being said, we're going to move into another update and announcement. This one is very exciting to me because I got to be involved a little bit on the behind the scenes from a demo perspective. But during Rohan Kumar, our CVP of Azure Data's keynote at Microsoft Build, our friend and colleague Jason Anderson came on and did this awesome demo on SQL Ledger. But for those of you who have not seen SQL Ledger before, what I want to do is I actually want to bring up Jason and we'll talk through it. So Jason, welcome to the show. We're happy to have you here. I'm just going to pass it over to you. I'd love to learn more about SQL Ledger.
Great, thanks, Anna. I'm excited to be here, and I'm happy to talk about what we're doing and what we've announced to build. So let's dive into it. So Azure SQL Database Ledger is a new capability inside of Azure SQL Database that brings the power of blockchain into SQL, the ability to effectively get tamper evidence inside of your SQL database without having to deploy a complex blockchain to do that. So effectively, we're making data tamper evident, and we're using the same cryptographic patterns you might see in a blockchain to do that. And I'll walk through this in a second. In addition to that, if you're familiar at all with blockchain, you know that a blockchain is append only. You can't make any updates or deletes. With Azure SQL Database Ledger, we have the ability to support an updatable pattern where you can update and delete rows, but then still also preserve the history of those rows and cryptographically verify that the data has been adequately or properly changed. And the best thing about the capability of Ledger is that it's a feature in Azure SQL. That means that you don't have to migrate to a new service. You can just turn it on for existing databases, and you get that tamper evidence capabilities out of the box. So let me spend a second and talk about how this works. So we have two types of table capabilities inside of Ledger. The first is updatable, as I talked about, and the other is an append-only pattern if you want that pattern, and I'll talk through why that could be important. So updatable ledger tables allow updates and deletes, as I talked about. So what happens effectively is when you submit a transaction, let's say I did an update to a row inside of my database, the previous value of that row that I changed is actually copied over to a history table. So we have that preserved for historical purposes. In addition to that, those transactions each get their own transaction ID, so you can then have data lineage capabilities to be able to determine, hey, what transaction touched which row in my database? We then construct this ledger view, so you get a chronicle of the database or of that table over time, so you can see what the current value is and what the previous values were. Now, all of that is just data lineage. The magic under the hood is the cryptography, and what I'm showing you here is really a logical diagram of what we call the database ledger, which is effectively the blockchain. But effectively, every transaction coming into the system is cryptographically hashed using SHA-256. just like a blockchain. So each transaction is linked together. So if you make even one change, a single bit maliciously in the database, it can be detected. So how is it detected? Well, we effectively take those transaction hashes that are created in the blockchain data pattern, and we push them outside of SQL into a trusted storage location. And this is really important because those digests really represent the data integrity, or the what I'd say the root of trust is for your database. You use those digests to then later verify or to detect if tampering has actually happened. So I'd call a stored procedure effectively that would references those digests that are in that trusted storage location. And then we recalculate the hashes in the database real time. And either the hashes that we recalculated match what was stored in the trusted storage, or it doesn't. And if it doesn't match, then you know a tampering event has occurred. Then you can use the forensics information that's provided to be able to then rectify that. You could restore your database to a previous point in time and get the proper values in. Now, append-only ledger tables on the cryptographic side are just like updatable ledger tables. The only difference is we block updates and deletes at the API layer. That means DBA can't go in and issue a malicious update or delete to a table because verification wouldn't catch that. So by blocking that, you can ensure that your data is protected not only on the back end, but then also from a privileged user perspective. And this is a great pattern for applications like security event and information management systems that are append-only by default, or Azure SQL Database Ledger can also be used as what's called an off-chain store for blockchain, where you effectively replicate your blockchain over to a database. So you could do the complex querying and have the performance that you want, and then maintain that data integrity from the blockchain to the off-chain database. So this is just a quick peek. If you want to learn more, we're going to have a deep dive on this on Data Exposed Live on the 16th, so make sure to attend that. And Azure SQL Database Ledger is available today in the West Central US region. We're going to have more regions coming soon, so keep an eye out for that. But you can go in, and when you create your database, you'll be able to enable Ledger functionality and be able to take advantage of it right away. So,
awesome. Thanks so much.
Back to you, Anna.
Thanks. I wasn't sure what was happening next, but here we go. You know, Jason, we did get a question that came in from the audience. This person says, does this table support all the data types?
Yes, it does. In fact, the way you can think about ledger tables are, they're not a new type of table. We've just added this functionality to existing tables. There are some limitations because you can't be able to drop columns and tables easily because we want to be able to protect those. But we have that listed in our documentation on what the limitations are. But in general, our goal is to not have any breaking changes. Effectively, you don't need to change your applications. You don't need to change your T-SQL. It'll just work. You can turn it on and be able to have this capability out of the box.
That's awesome. I think that's what everyone wants to hear, is that it works with their existing tables and it just works, and you can just use T-SQL. This is a really cool technology. I do want to mention to everyone that those URLs that Jason shared will be in the news update blog that is now posted at aka.ms/news update. So if you want any of those references, I definitely recommend reading the white paper. Wow, I was just blown away by the tech that you all have put into this. I also wanted to give a special shout out. Jason didn't know I was going to do this, but we're celebrating your 25th year at Microsoft. So congratulations. And, you know, all of us are impressed by all the cool tech you're bringing to Azure SQL.
Thanks, Anna. It's my pleasure to be here.
Awesome. Thanks. Okay. Well, thank you so much, Jason. We have more announcements to come, so we're going to keep on rolling. So our next announcement is going to be around change data capture. So this is something that just went into public preview, I think yesterday, I believe. And to talk more about that, I'm going to bring Mara, the lead program manager for this product, on. Hi, Mara. How's it going?
Hi, Anna. I'm good. How are you? Thanks for having me.
Good. I'm awesome. Yeah, we are so excited to have you. I'd love to just learn more, because I personally don't know a ton about CDC. I'd love to learn more about, you know, what was announced and how I can, you know, use this capability.
Yes, happy to do that. So as you are mentioning, we are very excited to introduce public preview of CDC on Azure SQL databases. So as you might know, CDC has been available for some time in SQL Server, on Azure SQL and MI, and after multiple customer requests, we decided to make it available on Azure SQL databases as well. And before we go into the details of the preview, I want to give a brief overview of how change data capture works in general. So first, you would have to enable your database, and within this database, the tables that you want to track for DML changes. Each table that you enable for CDC has a corresponding CDC table, as you can see in this diagram. And then you have, in Azure SQL MI and in SQL Server, you have two jobs, a capture job and a cleanup job. The capture job takes the DML changes that were added to the transaction log and adds them to the corresponding CDC table, while the cleanup job deletes the CDC tables based on a retention policy. And these were all SQL Server agent jobs in SQL Server and Azure SQL MI. And lastly, once you get all the changes in change data capture tables, you can use query functions to consume those changes. You can send all those DML data changes to other downstream subscribers. You can run analytics on them, and we'll discuss some other use cases. So this is a brief overview of how change data capture looks like on Azure SQL MI and SQL Server. And with the public preview of CDC on Azure SQL databases, for customers, the experience will be very similar to what they've gotten used to. However, on the back end, the key difference is that the SQL Server agent cleanup and capture jobs have been replaced by a CDC scheduler. So this CDC scheduler invokes those stored procedures to clean up and to capture changes on automatically, basically. However, customers can still run on-demand stock procedures that you can see on my screen if you want to run capture or clean up on demand. However, this scheduler on the background would automatically run these processes. It's worth noting that this feature is available on Azure SQL databases that are higher than standard 3. And also, when it comes to roles and permissions, back in Azure SQL MI and in SQL Server, you used to need a sysadmin role in order to use CDC. However, now it's all about the DB owner role. So these are some key things to keep in mind when you decide to use CDC in Azure SQL databases. But overall, the experience is very similar to what you've gotten used to so far.
Awesome.
So yes, so moving onwards to some use cases for CDC and CDC in Azure SQL databases more specifically. As I was mentioning, you can decide to track data changes for audit purposes, to perform analytics on them. You can propagate these changes to other subscribers. For instance, you might decide to use other Microsoft services such as Azure Data Factory to take those changes and move them to other destinations. Similarly, ETL operations from the OLTP to data lake or data warehouse. And lastly, you can decide to do event-based programming to respond instantaneously to CDC data changes. So these are just some of the few key use cases that we've noticed our customers like to use CDC for. And lastly, this is a series of, these are all the resources that we're offering on CDC. As you can see, I highlighted that we're going to have a bi-weekly blog series starting this week on CDC in Azure SQL databases. So you should go on the tech community and see the blogs. You can learn more about CDC and more about how you can take these changes from the change tables and send them to other destinations. We'll explore different apps to do that. And yes, that's pretty much on our announcement. Thanks
so much, Mara. You know, I didn't know that you all were going to be starting this bi-weekly blog series. I'll have to check that out. It sounds really interesting. I also think it's cool that you were able to very quickly tell us, you know, hey, it works just like CDC, like you're used to, except for a few changes like around ownership of the database, which makes sense because there's no such thing as like a real full-blown server in Azure SQL database. So it kind of makes sense. It's kind of logical. I'm just gonna check, and we do have a comment that came in that said start from great news. So I'm gonna take that as a positive thing. I think that sounds great. People are excited to see all the updates. And for all of the links that Mara shared in her resources, you can head to aka.ms/news update. That should be posted now. You can get all those resources, and you'll want to go ahead and subscribe to our blog or the RSS feed because Mara's gonna be posting bi-weekly blog posts there. Thanks again, Mara, so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Awesome. So we are just rolling. We are 15 minutes in. We've already had 2 guest speakers. I think we're doing really great. Those are just 2 updates so far, but we have more updates. Now, for this next update, this is kind of cool because we get to go cross-org with who we bring on the show. I'm actually going to bring up Kaza, who is a program manager on the Azure Resource Mover team. You might be wondering, why does this relate to me and Azure SQL? Well, over the past few years, obviously, Azure has started to expand rapidly the amount of regions that are available for your Azure SQL and other resources that are available. Now, as these new regions become available, maybe you might want to move them to other regions. I'm not exactly sure. That's why we brought Kaza on. Kaza, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Anna. Excited to be here. And and I would love to talk more about Azure Resource Mover and what it could do for helping moving Azure SQL DBs across regions, right?
Awesome.
So I think rightly you pointed out, right? Like one of the key advantages of the competitive advantage from Azure perspective is it's a large footprint, right? We have 60 plus regions and counting. So one of the key things which customers are looking for is whenever a new region is getting launched, they want to be closer to their customers. If the region happens to be within the vicinity where their customers are, that way they can optimize the workloads and sort of reduce the latency and all of the good stuff, right? So that's one of the key primary motives why customers are looking for a capability, so that way they can utilize moving to the new region which is coming up, right? Tied to that is many customers are looking to add high availability, high resiliency aspects to their applications and resources. So if they can move from a region which is not AZ supported and maybe a new region is coming up in their environment which is actually AZ enabled, so they can actually move their resources, VMs or SQL DBs into sort of zone redundant databases in the new region coming up, right? So that's one of the key top the use cases, if you will. And associated to that is a lot of customers, as we see, because of data sovereignty, compliance, regulatory aspects which have come up in the recent past. So there's been a lot of asks from customers, hey, is there a way I can actually co-locate all my resources in my primary geopolitical boundary where I operate and do my business, right? So that's one of the key hero motion where we have taken a lot of feedback from customers which have large amount of data, right? So from a data governance perspective. And the last is, as customers look to kind of expand their footprint and they want to kind of do M&As and acquire or probably divest, so they end up with disparate set of resources in the overall Azure different regions, right? But they're looking to kind of optimize their footprint on Azure from an ease of manageability, simplicity perspective. They can take advantage of the service, which is Azure Resource Mover, and kind of co-locate their resources in one or two their primary regions where they operate, right? So to address all these different customer use cases or scenarios, if you will, we launched Azure Resource Mover. It's currently GA since March of this year. And the primary benefits are, and as I was mentioning, one of the key things is obviously optimizing workloads. You can be closer to your customers and add high availability, resiliency aspects. But the bigger things is, as customers can look to move not only like SQL DBs, elastic pools, they will have virtual machines, networking components, NICs, network security groups, all the different things which Azure offers, right? So Azure Resource Mover provides a unified single sort of pane of glass experience where doesn't matter the type of resource, you can actually follow the same workflow and move your sort of resources from source to target region, right? So that gives them the customers the the seamlessness. It gives them the ease of managing such a complex move, if you will. And given that different technologies use different resources, use different technologies underneath the hood to sort of do replication and whatnot. So Resource Mover actually abstracts all of that, and customers are pretty much transparent to what happens underneath the hood, right? You pretty much click, 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 off you go, right? So you complete your journey from source to target side. And this actually gives you the benefit of reducing the overall time and complexity and the number of, the hours it takes from previously before Resource Mover used to exist compared to now, right? So that's a huge benefit. And all of that comes in, I know the customers have this, they can plan the move at their own scheduled downtime event, so they can have full control over the move, and then they can actually try and test it before they actually commit to the going to the target region, right? And all of this goodness actually happens within the Azure secure space, so none of the resources actually leave the secure Azure environment. So you definitely have the the peace of mind, right, where that you're moving resources from source to target region, and all of that is intact, right? So that's at a very high level, the key, the benefits which customers would see utilizing a service such as Azure Resource Mover. Just a real quick snapshot on what resources we support today. Obviously, Azure has more than 150 odd different resource types, but we actually support a few, as you see on the service. And from a SQL perspective, we support SQL DBs and elastic pools. SQL managed instance and SQL servers are actually currently not supported as of GA, but we are actively working with the our engineering team and SQL engineering team to hopefully come up with the capability in the subsequent releases down the road, right? So that is pretty much in a quick nutshell what do we support. And I'll shift gears to show a quick demo on how the Azure Resource Mover actually functions on the Azure portal. So I'm showing the screen for Azure, portal.azure.com. So in the search, you can just search for Azure Resource Mover, and then that pops up. So in the screen, what you see is 3 different move constructs, right? You can move resources across subscriptions. You can move resources across resource groups. These first two are actually supported by Azure Resource Manager, which is a different service altogether. But from Azure Resource Mover perspective, it's primarily talking about cross-region move, right? So if you see this, so let's click on this, and it's gonna when you start the journey, it's gonna ask you very simple, basic questions. You're gonna pick your subscription. It's gonna ask you, hey, go find your resources, right? So I'm gonna say I have, for the sake of this demo, I've kept some SQL Server and DBs in West US 2, and let's move them to South Central US, right? So you're gonna click next. And the next blade is basically saying, go select the resources, right? So you're going to go select the resources, and I'm going to go filter based on the resource I've selected. There you go, right? You see the SQL DB and SQL Server. I'm doing a very quick, simple demo, just for the interest of time. So you're going to click next, and kind of gives you a preview as to what you have done thus far and what are the next subsequent steps which you're going to see, right? It's just a quick blurb, and you're going to click proceed, right? So the resources take a little bit of a time to get added. So in the interest of time, I'm going to jump directly into the sort of the unified experience, if you will. And this is what you'll look like, right? Where basically this is actually still pointing to my previous, the sandbox, if you will. And I'm going to change that to South Central US, and I'm going to say done, right? So the resources I added, there you go, just showed up here, right? So one of the key things which customers need to do after this, after adding, is it's going to ask you to validate dependencies, right? So where one of the key, intelligence which the service has is, if you add a SQL DB, your SQL Server is sort of a dependent resource. You got to go find it, right? So it's already telling you that right in the front that you got to go find your, SQL Server, and then ensure that you add to the, the move collection, and then you continue your rest of your journey, right? So that's the subsequent next step. And this is the workflow which I was talking about, which is the unified, the same structured workflow, which is prepare, initiate, move. Then you can commit to the move on the target side or discard, as if there is, this is not the time, or, you choose to do it at a different time. So there's an option to even fail back, if you will. So there is an option to discard it. And prepare is basically a long running operation where the replication of the SQL databases start, right? So from here, an API call goes from, from the portal, the client, and then from there it goes to Azure Resource Mover Orchestrator, which is the service on top. From there, the API call goes to SQL GeoDR, right? That is where we leverage the SQL GeoDR replication engine behind the scenes to actually replicate the SQL DBs from the source to the target side. So from a SQL Server perspective, since I mentioned we don't actually technically have a move capability yet, we actually ask customers to bring in a SQL Server on the target side and then map that to the source server, right? That's why it's asking you to go map the resource, if you will, the source server to the target server. That way the DBs underneath can actually replicate seamlessly across, right? So that is where the prepare starts. And the beauty of this is you can actually do the replication while your, the source DB, your server, and your application is still intact, right? So depending on the amount of data, the prepare can take, X amount of time, a few hours, or maybe even sometimes even longer than that. So the good part is there's no downtime at that point, right? So the once you complete the prepare, initiate move is primarily deploying like ARM templates, if you will, on the target side. So it's a very smaller operation compared to like a large scale, long running operation such as prepare. The discard is like an optional step which you choose, you don't want to move it. But once you commit to commit, right, that is when the secondary DB you created on the target side actually becomes the new primary, right? Because you're going to update the connection strings. You're going to point the connection strings to the new SQL Server and the DB on the target side. And then pretty much your application now starts talking to the new the secondary, which is the the new primary, which is the secondary which you have just created, right? And the good part is your source DB is still intact. Nothing happens to it. It's pretty much like a standalone DB left behind. So depending on the customer use case, they can choose to use it. If they have other data or applications and whatnot. But for some customers, they want to kind of go ahead and delete that, right? So based on that, we've gotten some feedback where we have created a capability called a delete source, where if you want, it's an optional step. You can actually go and delete, clean up the source DBs as well. Right. So this is like a very high level sneak peek. Obviously, there's a lot more feature functionality and capabilities built in where you can actually learn more. So for additional resources, I'm going to go back to my screen and.
Yep. Kaza, just because time, we're going to go ahead and just keep moving. But for everyone watching, we do want to remind you all that all of the links and resources that Kaza has available are going to be shared in the blog, which we have been mentioning throughout the session. So just want to let you know, Kaza, thanks so much for joining us. We really appreciate it. I see a lot of use cases for this, so I'm excited to go try it out myself and maybe even move some databases to a region that supports something like availability zone. So thanks so much for coming on the show, Kaza.
Absolutely. Thanks a lot, Anna. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Sure. Awesome. So moving right along, hopefully you all haven't exploded with all these awesome updates yet, but we have some really awesome updates around IQP, or Intelligent Query Processing, coming up. And who else to have on the show than Pedro Lopes? Pedro, thanks so much for joining us today.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me here.
We are stoked to have you on the show, and I'm just going to pass it off to you. I want to hear all about IQP and especially what's new, because I think you guys had some announcements recently.
We do, but first I want to take you down a trip down memory lane for a minute or so. And this is just to give you a notion of how much we've evolved in this area in the past around 3-4 years. We have all these scenarios being covered in intelligent query processing. And one thing in common is that all of these are driven by these 3 principles you see on the screen. They need to be available by default just by moving to the latest DB compat level, meaning there's no code changes for you to start leveraging these improvements. Many of these address real pains, historical pains, when customers run code in the SQL engine. They need to deliver broad impact for all performance issues or improve performance in critical workloads. When I said minimal implementation effort, it's because there's one specifically that I have with an asterisk on the screen there. There is a new function and therefore requires a code change to use. But everything else, like I said, is just plug and play. You flip the bit on the vcompat and you're using it. And finally, the intent is that all these critical workloads that run in parallel should just continue running at scale, remain adaptive to the changing data in the underlying databases, and there's no interaction with the developers in terms of code changes. So awesome. I'd like to just point out a couple. For example, memory grant feedback. This is the ability for the engine to adjust the memory being used by queries and to learn from past executions in order to eliminate classic problems like spills to TempDB, which add I/O and add time to execute, or memory overestimations, which lead to memory misuse and can affect concurrency in the engine. So this is just one of many scenarios that we've dealt with so far, and they're present in SQL 2017. The ones that are not in bold on the screen, they're completed in the SQL 2019 and obviously Azure SQL database in all the 3 that you see on the screen right now. So to know more about this, because today's topic is not about what we've done so far, it's about what's next. You can learn about each of these features in that short URL there, aka.ms/IQP. We also have self-guided demos and SQL notebooks for all of these scenarios in that other URL there, aka.ms/IQP demos.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Pedro. This is really cool to see kind of where we're going, and I think people will definitely want to check out these details. Is there anything else new in this space that you want to highlight?
Absolutely. Let's move there. This is exciting. So one thing that's actually starting the public preview today is query store hints. Now, what are query store hints? This feature provides a simple method for hinting and therefore tweaking the way SQL Server may shape and execute query plans. So without having to change the application code. So more often than not, customers have their T-SQL code being sent by the application, for example, if you're using an ORM. And therefore, there's not much leeway in terms of changing the code to tweak it or to hint it in order to overcome some specific scenario or tune it in a specific way. So with Query Store hints, we actually now have the ability to, through Query Store, through a query that is captured in Query Store as is coming from the application, actually add one or more hints there. And the DBA can do this, and therefore influencing subsequent executions. In some ways, it is, this obviously leverages Query Store, which is on by default in Azure SQL Database. And amongst all the benefits that having Query Store provides you in terms of insight to your workload, now you have this, the real ability to influence how the engine executes a given query or set of queries.
Cool. Pedro, one question I have when I see this is, is this going to replace or can it replace plan guides?
Very good question. So Query Store could already replace in itself, since its inception, one part of the scenarios for plan guides, which was the ability to force a specific plan for a given query. But it didn't allow this other part, which is, can I add hints? Can I influence how the optimizer will optimize the given query? And now we have that ability. So I would say pretty much for the 95% scenario for plan guides, we have now a replacement that is scalable, and it can be used going forward without the complication and complexity of implementing plan guides.
Very nice.
So next we have another feature called CE feedback. And CE feedback, the name CE stands for cardinality estimation, which is a fundamental process in query optimization that's internal to the engine. Now, CE feedback, the feature will essentially, because the optimizer works with a set of models and some assumptions, we know that one model doesn't fit all scenarios. And so, but up until now, when a query a plan got created for a given query, you were kind of stuck with whatever was the plan that was optimized at that point.
Right.
With CE feedback, if we detect specific types of let's say imprecisions or in effect things that are not efficient, then we can correct them in subsequent executions. So the CE feedback feature will identify whatever are model-related assumptions, evaluate, so for repeating queries only, evaluate if there are corrections to be made, test those corrections or those and verify based on your own workload that is running. And if the replacement helps, it will replace the currently cached plan, and you didn't have to do a thing. You didn't have to tune your query in order for it to just behave better. And these are the scenarios that we're shipping in V1. We'll be having a public preview later this year in Azure SQL Database. And you can read a lot more about this also in our documentation.
Cool. I think I remember hearing a few customers that had hit issues, maybe some regressions in Azure after upgrading to Azure SQL. Is this going to address that?
Absolutely. So some of the scenarios that are most common, especially coming from older versions of the SQL engine, moving up to Azure or even to newer versions of SQL Server, is precisely some of the scenarios that we are tackling in this first version. So in essence, this means that the inherent risk that could come from migrating across several versions, so come from very old to very new, this is pretty much mitigated automatically for you. And now we go to the last scenario here. And the last scenario that we'll also be previewing later this year in Azure SQL has to do with the problem of parameter-sensitive plans, or PSP for short. This is also known as parameter sniffing issues. In essence, it means that when you have a store procedure and you execute with a given parameter, that store procedure, the plan for that store procedure gets cached, and that's the plan that you use for any given execution of that store procedure, no matter what set of parameters are incoming. Now, when you have widely variant data in the underlying tables, that may mean that what was an optimal plan for one incoming parameter is not optimal for a different incoming parameter because it, let's say, reads many more rows or less rows, depends on the case. So the problem is that we only have a single cached plan for a parameterized query, and that's typically not optimal for all possible incoming parameter values. And you see on the screen a number of boxes that essentially try to give you some classical techniques that developers may use to forcefully hint their queries to move away or work around this potential issue. And by the way, most of these, not all, but some of these can be used in the new feature of query store hints. So you have the ability to, for example, to use option recompile and recompile every time, which means that you're essentially always generating a new plan for a new incoming execution request for the store procedure. That adds overhead, for example. Or you have optimized for a known option, but that means that you have, let's say, a generic plan that's probably not optimized for all scenarios. It's just good enough. So these are some of the pains that customers have felt.
Yeah, I mean, I personally have hit a few of these, and it is a pain. So what can we do, or what's new?
Right. So then it comes this new feature that we're working on, and it's the ability to effectively add multiple active cached plans for a single parameterized query, and we're dubbing that PSP optimization. So what happens is that during the initial compilation, we'll be able to evaluate what are the predicates that exist in the query based on the parameters that are incoming, and what are the most, let's say, at-risk predicates there. And we'll just handle at most 3. And so we'll use that information plus information coming from statistics that are kept over the underlying table columns to be able to identify these predicates and then create, let's say, bucketized possible plans or possible options that are more efficient for a given scenario. So, for example, if you have a predicate that states where agent ID equals, and then you have a parameter, we'll use the column statistics histograms to identify where you have non-uniform distributions in that column agent ID, and we'll be able to break it down towards, okay, we have a plan that's better for when you have very few agents that match that agent ID, or when we have more, or when we have most of the table, for example. And then we'll be able to have something like you see on the screen here, or sorry, you see on the screen here, which is we have an incoming parameterized query. We have something we call the dispatcher plan, and then because we analyze those at-risk predicates, we'll be able to immediately create a plan that's optimal for that incoming parameter. For example, when the query, the agent IDs will return less than 10,000 rows. But then you have other scenarios based, again, on looking at statistics. Maybe you have an optimal plan that's good for when agent IDs, when the number of rows written by agent ID is more than 10,000, but still less than 1 million. And probably you have another plan that's good enough when you have more than 1 million rows being returned. So we'll be able to identify these from the get-go and have multiple active cached plans for each of these scenarios. So you'll never fall, or you'll fall less into the typical pains of having those parameterized query scenarios.
Wow, awesome, Pedro. That's really interesting. For our viewers, again, there are resources to learn more about this in our news update blog. Additionally, we posted a short video today, just now, with Joe Sack on some of the query store hints advancements. So Pedro, I just want to thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. Now we're going to keep on rolling. We have more updates. I know you guys can't believe it. We have more updates. But next, we are going to bring on Alexandra. Alexandra, hello. And we are going to talk about some of the new updates related to heterogeneous migrations, I think. So Alexandra, take it away.
Thank you very much, Anna. Definitely it's going to be heterogeneous, and I have a surprise for you guys looking at homogeneous migration. Something that's not public yet, but I'm just going to leave that towards the end of the presentation.
Awesome.
So first, let's go through the public part. What have we released? So I'm not sure if you're all familiar, but SQL Server Migration Assistant is a suite of 5 tools used by our customer to migrate from heterogeneous databases to Azure SQL. Azure SQL On-Prem, Azure SQL DB, or Azure SQL MI. In terms of heterogeneous sources, we support DB2, we support MySQL, Oracle, Access, and Sybase ASE. Now, we are at release 8.20, which is just made public. And we have enabled one of the features asked by our customer, and that is around partition tables in Oracle. So before this release, you as a customer needed to spend a lot of time translating hundreds of partition tables from Oracle to SQL Server. We took care of that, and we developed the mechanisms to automatically enable that partition. Besides this feature, we also have other new useful conversions. One of them is the skip locked clause. In terms of DB2, we have improved the varchar format emulation function. So I know in some cases it was not really matching all the formats that the user was expecting, and we do hope to cover all of those corner cases with the latest release. Another thing that we've heard from our customer was around discovery for DB2.4i. So there were certain queries addressing some of the DMVs that were rewritten, and now they should work without any issues. So just give it a try. In the automatic partition conversion, I think that's something really interesting, and I want to drill down a little bit on the details of the implementation. So in Oracle, we all know we have 3 types of partitioning: range partition, hash partition, and list partition, plus a combination of the above. When we go from Oracle to SQL, we don't have a direct migration path. It's not really easy to match, for example, hash partitioning or list partitioning. So in SQL Server Migration Assistant 8.20, we built the logic to simulate those functionalities in SQL Server. How did we do it? Well, it's not that complicated. I'm just going to look at the hash partition function. The basic idea for list and hash partitioning is using computed columns and then use that computed column as a partition key in your partition function. So in the upper part of my screen, you can see the definition, the PL/SQL definition of the table, including the hash partitions with free partitions, and then the translation that we've made for Azure SQL and SQL on-prem. So we basically created the partition function, provided the computed column that is calculated based on the hashed byte function and on concatenation of the Oracle columns, and then distribution of the data among different file groups. Well, in Oracle, the file group concept doesn't exist, so we had to do a mapping between table spaces and file groups. This is going to make your life much easier, and it's definitely going to reduce the manual conversion time that you require. Now, another thing that we've released, and this is very interesting, last week was called Data Access Migration Toolkit. And the new thing is that we actually support the IBM DB2 dialect. The tool is used by our customers and partners in order to identify dynamic PL/SQL, TSQL, or DB2 SQL code coming from within the application code. So in a nutshell, you just open in Visual Studio Code your application repository, you install the extension, and then you can analyze it using any of these free dialects. You have all the list of supported file types that you can use in this analysis, and also the dialects that we support. The output, the extraction of these dynamic SQL queries can then be converted using SSMA to T-SQL. So that's a pretty cool thing, and it's going to make the life easier for the developers, and also it's going to accelerate migrations by identifying this sort of queries within our code. And the last but not least is Data Migration Assistant. We haven't released it yet, so it's going to be available tomorrow or Monday. Fingers crossed for tomorrow. And the new thing here is the SQL recommendation, the SKU recommendation console. We've built this experience from scratch. We've heard your feedback. We try to explain each and every dimension that we collect, and we try to provide a reasoning for each and every recommended target. So we don't just give you the SKU, but we also recommend the sizing for that SKU. If the print screen does not convince you, you just give it a try and you'll see the difference compared to the older version of the algorithm. And another change is the fact that we are now collecting performance data from system DMVs, and we are not using the performance counters for that purpose anymore. So
Awesome.
Stay tuned for that.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Alexandra, for coming on the show. And just a quick plug, Alexandra's been doing a ton of Data Exposed episodes with us. So go check out our YouTube channel. They have a whole playlist called Migrating to SQL where you can learn more and actually see each of these tools in action. Again, thanks so much, Alexandra.
Thank you so much, Anna. Back to you.
Awesome. Cool. Hopefully you guys are enjoying this. It's kind of exciting to see all of these announcements taking place. Now you get to listen to me for a little bit. I have a few other announcements I want to get out there. A few things. We recently announced enhancements for Azure SQL Managed Instance backups. This used to be a single file at a time, but now we've introduced this parallel system, which can help us take your backups faster, which is always a good thing to hear. We also announced an increase in the maximum storage size for Azure SQL Managed Instance in the general purpose tier. This is coming at the end of June, and this is doubling the size. So this has been a huge customer ask. So I think you all are really going to be excited about this one. A few other updates that are there that you can read more and get more information in the blog. I want to show you some of the blogs and updates. Of course, from the Azure blog, so from the Azure blog, there were a bunch of articles around the build timeframe a few weeks ago that recap all the different things from data and AI perspective. A few that I found specifically interesting, of course, go check out all of these, but one of them was this ground processing with space data 5 times faster in Azure. Not only is this truck or Tahoe or Suburban just like the coolest thing ever, but what we're doing here is we're able to do space analytics, which is a very cool thing for us to do. Very exciting. So you want to go check that one out. The other thing, of course, maybe you've noticed is we have a new Azure icon in the blog. There's a blog that just talks about why we did this and how it goes with our design principles. And you can also submit your feedback on what you think of the new Azure icon. I personally do like it. Okay, we also released a lot of Data Exposed episodes. I mentioned with Alexandra, we have our Migrating to SQL series that has gone on. So that's what you're seeing a lot of our episodes this past month. We also had a very exciting Star Wars episode. John Morehouse, an MVP from the community, dressed up as a Jedi, and I dressed up as Princess Leia, and we did a whole themed episode. It was a lot of fun. Not going to want to miss it. We also had some great live episodes, including Azure Monitor for SQL Insights, some data science stuff with Buck Woody, and some interesting information on storage in Azure SQL virtual machines. We also released some blogs in SQL Server Tech Community and Microsoft SQL Server blog. I'm not going to go over those, but basically it's just updates to some of our drivers and some CU management packs and that sort of thing. Now, in the Azure SQL Tech community, we actually released a lot of blogs this month. So I'm not going to get to highlight all of them. We actually had a lot of people come on the show and talk about their updates. A few I wanted to mention are actually here. Azure SQL Edge can now run on RHEL, which is pretty exciting. So you can go try that out. This blog actually talks about how to do that. And then the other thing I wanted to call out is that Sasa Povkovic has been doing a little mini series on how you can migrate from managed instance back to SQL Server. And you might be wondering, why is that a thing? But a lot of corporations actually have to have, for compliance reasons, or they don't want to get stuck in Azure. They want to know that they can leave if they want to. So he has this great series on how you can use replication or a backpack file to do that. Additionally, we had some other blogs in Dev's Corner related to the learning path I talked about at the beginning of this episode, as well as the Azure Database Support blog. They posted some really interesting troubleshooting tips on various things that they saw with customers in the past month. Now we have one more segment for today. We're going to be talking about how to locate SQL content by using the table of contents in the Microsoft Docs. For that, I have Cheryl and Mike Ray. So let me just bring them up here. Hi, folks. I'm just going to pass it over to you all.
Thanks so much, Anna, for doing that. And yeah, welcome to SQL in a Minute, where we talk about everything related to SQL Docs. And today we've got a special treat. I have Mike Ray, who's a senior content developer here at Microsoft, an excellent resource to our team. Mike, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. It's great to see you, Cheryl. This has been a great show.
Great. You know, Mike and I have these really great conversations, and we're going to bring one of our conversations to this space. We were having an interesting conversation about how people search for content within SQL Docs. We know that people normally use a very popular search engine to find content. Mike, you had a good way on narrowing down that search. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about it.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. If you don't mind, we'll share my screen for a minute. We know that people come into our doc set from search engines, and they land here at some place in our doc set. And in the table of contents, we have over 10,000 articles sitting here at your finger, but sometimes it's difficult to find exactly what you want. One thing we've spent a little bit of time doing is improving this filtering functionality. So one problem that used to exist, if you wanted to create a table, when you searched create table, the table of contents didn't filter to the table, the SQL Server reference topic. It would give you this topic, which is close but not quite where you wanted to be, and you can now get directly to the create table topic, for example. And so this filter capability has kind of been enhanced and improved, and is a little bit more accessible than it was. And I think you should take a whack at filtering down to make sure you can narrow from the 10,000 topics of the table of contents the specific items you want. So that's one of the exciting spaces where we've been working. I tested it during Pedro's really informative talk, and so you can even find our newest content here. So if we were to search Query Store, we find Query Store hints. So if you hear about a new feature, this was published very recently, and it brings us right here to the docs. Another thing you'll notice, an area there where we've been spending some time, is we've been spending some time with correcting and improving the clarity for what an article applies to. At this moment, Query Store hints applies to our cloud offerings, Azure SQL Database and SQL Managed Instance. So it gives us clarity on whether this applies to other flavors of SQL Server or other products. And at this point, it doesn't. So you can use this applies to this applies to tab to clarify what you need and what you're looking for. So that kind of are some areas where we have been investing, and we have a lot more information available for you out on the web. And I don't know if Cheryl, would you have any other questions for me at this time?
Well, I think it's great that we can have these opportunities to really talk about the content, because a lot of a developer's job and their journey is really doing research and looking for information. So it looks like you were able to show us that even using a search engine and getting to that landing page, we can drill down and find specific content related to what we're working on. And that's so important. I wanted to bring out also that the documentation not only includes what we show, what was some of the reference material, but we also have built-in tutorials, which are just as informative. So if you're not very knowledgeable about this space, go to the landing page, seek out the SQL Docs, and look for the things that are marked as the tutorials or how-tos. I love those because those are really great. Quick starts are good too if you really need to get something going. And if you want to dig deeper, we have that alternative, deeper content as well. I want to thank you, Mike, for joining us today. As you can see on the screen, we left our landing page here, how you can contribute and provide feedback, our email address, and also follow us on Twitter. Thank you so much, Anna.
Awesome. Great. Thank you guys so much. The docs are so important. So it's so crucial that you understand how to find stuff in the docs. So again, thanks so much for coming on for SQL in a Minute and helping us out.
Thank you.
All right. We have one more person to come on the show today. I can't believe it. You probably can't believe it that we're going to put this many people on the show. But I'm bringing up Marisa. Marisa, take it away.
Hi, all. Yes, so as Anna mentioned earlier, we are at the Microsoft SQL Server and Azure SQL conference this week. So from we were here on Monday. We're here till Friday. There are a few more sessions this week, and on Friday, Anna and Bob are actually giving a post-con on the Azure SQL workshop. Also this week, Silvano is at Dev Days Europe. On June 25th, we have the C# Corner Women Data Summit. Anna will be there, and Mara, who is also on the show, will be there talking about Azure SQL. On June 29th, there is a special 2-hour Azure Hybrid and Multi-Cloud digital event where I even heard an Azure Arc big announcement will be there, so make sure to tune into that. And as always, we have this Data Exposed live show every Wednesday at 9 a.m. Pacific on Learn TV. Next week, we have the Azure SQL Security Series with Jason, who was on earlier. On June 23rd, we have a Something Old, Something New show with Buck Woody. And on June 30th, we have a deep dive, and that will be around Azure Arc 2. And also, we have our weekly on-demand Data Exposed episodes. Those launch every Thursday at 9 a.m. Pacific at aka.ms/Data Exposed YouTube. So join us there. Thanks, Anna.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Marisa. All right. Okay, so just a few more things. I have my Microsoft Learn module of the month. This is putting it all together with Azure SQL. As you all know, for the past few months, we've been going through each of the modules of the Azure SQL Fundamentals Learning Path. This is the last one. This is a great one where you can actually apply all the knowledge that you've done throughout the learning path, and you can even be prepared for DP300. We've heard a lot of people pass this after completing this learning path. So check it out. And the final learning path I want to mention is my pick of the month. This is the Azure Modern Apps learning path. It's called Build Serverless Full Stack Applications Using Azure, of course, featuring Azure SQL. I mentioned this at the top of the show, but there's also a video that goes with it. You can find the link to both in the blog. I want to thank you all so much for joining us today. I really appreciate it. We also have this, this logo. Where is it? Azure SQL News Update. You saw a lot today on the show, and that includes lots of resources. They're all in that blog that we have. And since we're in person here today, we have some fun cameos here in Orlando. You can join the chat and let us know if you know who these strangers are wandering around the room. But all things aside, it's great to have Bob Ward and Buck Woody here on the show with us today. We always find a way to have a lot of fun. You know, Bob, Buck, we do have a minute or so. Do you guys have anything you want to share?
Buck, you go first. Absolutely. Definitely check out the Something Old, Something New with Anna and I on the show. Bob's got a bunch of things coming up. This is just an exciting time to pay attention to what's going on.
Also, a quick shout out. We did a keynote called SQL Edge to Cloud yesterday. We were all on stage. Can you believe it? That's why we're here at this event. It's on YouTube. Go look at the Microsoft Developer channel. Look for the Dev Intersection Conference. Check out SQL Edge to Cloud. A lot of great stuff there.
Awesome. Well, we're so excited to have both of you guys make this cameo appearance. So thank you to everyone out there. We just want to thank you so much for joining the show. Remember to go to aka.ms/news update. And if you can believe it, we got through 8 speakers plus 2 cameos in an hour. I certainly am a little bit in disbelief, a little stressed out, but having some relief now. So again, just thank you all so much for joining us. And we hope to see you next time on Data Exposed.